Hi there, welcome to the Happy Chicken Coop YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about chicken grit and oyster shell. Before we get into that, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Also be sure to subscribe to our website, thehappychickencoop.com. If you subscribe using the link in the description, you'll receive a free ebook on the 10 best egg-laying chicken breeds. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. So unfortunately, a lot of people think that grit and oyster shells are the same thing. They're not. Your hens require both oyster shell and grit. Without it, serious health issues can occur, such as sauerkraut and brittle bones. But now we know our ladies need them, but why? Well, let's get into why. Chickens don't have the means to grind or masticate their food since they don't have teeth, so they need something to reduce the food particle size to a manageable form. The grit, after an ingestion, travels down into the gizzard where it will stay for quite a while until it is worn down sufficiently to pass to the bird without causing harm. Once it settles there, it goes to work helping the muscular gizzard to grind down the food into a nutritious paste from which the gut absorbs all the nutrients and water before eliminating the waste. Without grit, the food would not be rendered into a usable form for the bird. In fact, insufficient grit can cause things like impactions because the gut cannot deal with lumps of food. It just isn't set up that way. In general, the chicken's digestive system is highly efficient, but without grit, it can come to a halt. Now let's talk about how to feed grit to your chickens. The grit itself is made from granite or flint that is chipped into smaller sizes for chickens to be able to gulp it down easily. Grit can easily be purchased at the feed store online. It's pretty cheap. You should always provide a free choice grit for your birds. This means they should always have access to grit. Remember, it's better to have too much than not enough. Many people make the mistake of thinking that their birds will get all they need if they are free ranging, and the answer is it depends. Some soils don't have much grit in them, so the birds don't have anything to work with. They usually manage to find suitable grit during their free range expeditions, but if they are confined in a pen or run, it may be a problem to find sufficient grit. Chickens that are confined will absolutely need additional grit to aid their digestion if you feed them anything else other than the layer feed. As always, have a feeder of grit available for them to use if they want it. Chicks will not initially need grit until you start feeding them other things other than crumbles. Once you start giving them treats or clumps of grass or dandelions, they will need the grit. Up until 8 weeks, they will need chick grit, which is much finer. After the 8th week, they can graduate to regular chicken grit. Now let's talk about oyster shells. Oyster shell is exactly what it is, or exactly what it sounds like. Crushed oyster shell probably contains another shell too, but they are all high in calcium, which is what our ladies need. Oyster shell is known as a soluble grit. It's because it's dissolved in the hen's gut and is absorbed by the body and stored for later use in making shells or strengthening bones. Even though we are told that a layer feed is complete and that the hens do not need anything other than the feed, it may not contain enough calcium for your hens. Did you know that an egg is between 94 and 90% calcium carbonate? That's an awful lot of calcium. As with people, chickens are individual creatures, so the needs of one hen may not be the same as her neighbors. Some require more calcium as they are prolific layers, others not so much. Yet others may have a shell gland defect that requires more calcium than normal. Now let's talk about when oyster shells and grit aren't necessary. Only laying hens require oyster shells. Chicks, the older chicks and roosters do not require any oyster shell added to their diet. In fact, too much calcium can be detrimental to a hen's health, so it's best to offer up an oyster shell in a separate container. Those hens that need it will take it, the others will not. You can also feed eggshells back to the hens for extra calcium. I usually cook my used eggshells in the oven for about 30 minutes after I'm done baking. I turn the oven off and set the shells on a tray. This not only makes them easier to crush, but will destroy any bacteria. Make sure you crush the shell well enough to where they aren't recognizable as eggs, otherwise those smart hens might get some ideas. Some folks won't feed the shells back to their hens because of bacteria or fear of egg eating. The bacteria are taken care of by the cooking, and I have never had any hens eat eggs despite being given crushed eggshells. If you think about it logically, before oyster shells became freely available, grandma would have tossed out used eggshells with the daily scraps for the hens to pick over. So let's talk about how much and how often for grit and oyster shells. The best practice is to leave out a bowl of each item. I have a divided feeder attached to the wall of the coop, one side for grit, the other for oyster shell. This way the hens can help themselves when they feel they need one or both items. Some people sprinkle oyster shells into the feed. This is not a good idea. Too much calcium can lead to problems with the kidneys, which can be deadly. Let the hens self-regulate. They will do what's necessary for them. It's also best to let the hen self-regulate her grit intake also. As we mentioned, a little grit can go a long way, so the hen will be able to top up when she needs it. Now let's talk about the nutritional value of both grit and oyster shells. Oyster shell has calcium, like I said. Not only does it ensure good hard shells on the eggs, but it also ensures that the hens has strong, healthy bones. A hen that has a very low calcium level can suffer from broken bones, most noticeably in the feet and legs from jumping up and down to perches. Grit has no nutritional value in and of itself, but without it, the birds would not be able to process food properly. The grit helps to unlock all the nutrients in the food by grinding it down to a thick paste. Sauerkraut, and if you want to know about sauerkraut, we've created a video and an article as well, which I can link to in the description. It can be caused by insufficient grit in the gizzard. When a chicken eats, the food goes down to the crop for storage and later digestion. If the food cannot be processed due to lack of grit, the food will start to rot and your hen will develop a sauerkraut. Holding the grit in the gizzard is essential to the bird in order to process and derive nutrition from the food. If hens eat nothing but feed, it is said that they can live without grit, but our backyard girls enjoy free ranging and ingesting all sorts of seeds, greens, and bugs, so grit is necessary for these ladies. Now let's talk about industrial hens and grit. It's an interesting point here that industrial hens are not given any grit in any form. It's stated they do not need it since they eat nothing but layer feed. However, there has been some research that casts doubt over that assertion. If you've ever seen some of the ex-battery hens when they are rehomed, they look pretty rough and require lots of TLC and special attention. So to summarize, remember, grit and oyster shells are necessities for hens' health and welfare. Add these goodies to the menu for your hens to keep them healthy and active. Both items are cheap enough and will last a long time. I usually buy a bag of 50-pound oyster shell and 25-pound grit. This will both last for months, and I have 50+ birds. So you can just imagine if you only have 6. You can simply place some grit and oyster shell in separate bowls and your hens will self-regulate their intake. So do you have any tips about grit and oyster shell? Let us know in the comments below. That's going to do it for us here at the Happy Chicken Coop. Thanks for listening. If you find our content interesting, if you learned something new, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And with that, I hope you have a great day and we'll talk to you soon.